A and S. I imagine Dan Carlin fresh out of a time machine on the battlefields of ancient Britannia. There, wildly underdressed in his black t-shirt and ball cap, the screams and cries of hundreds of war-ravaged men roar around him. The thundering hooves of armor-clad horses send the dusty earth up into billowing clouds, and, as arrows whiz by his head, I imagine Dan not in panic, but drinking in every detail, cataloging the distinct metallic crunch of iron against ash and bronze. A journalist of the past, for once, living the story that he will bring back to his rabid, hardcore fans. I can't imagine Dan Carlin in the smoky, dim basement of Club 88, Los Angeles, 1983. Still in that signature black t-shirt, he listens to the little-known punk band NoFX, folds his arms, and sways among the throngs, looking peaceful while saturated by the band's counterculture guitar riffs and drums. Dear listeners, on today's episode, you will hear how this alchemy of curiosity and rebellion led him to see our historical stories with new eyes. A fresh alternative that eventually became the podcast, Hardcore History. Genuinely, I can't imagine our show existing without this audio iconoclast, one who cares so deeply for the current world by sharing its past. On the Ampersand, we call this bringing together of the impossible the alchemy of anding. Together, we'll hear stories of humans who imagine and create by colliding their interests. Rather than thinking of and as a simple conjunction in that conjunction-junction kind of way, we will hear stories of people who see and as a verb, a way to speak the beautiful when you intentionally let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. As St. Mary Oliver asks, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Oh, I love this question. When I'm mothering, creating, and collaborating, it reminds me to replace a singular idea of what I think I should become with a full sensory verb about experiencing. I'm Erika, Randall, and this is Dan Carlin on the Ampersand.
So here's my weird theory. The very first World Series that I was alive for, and I would have been almost one, was 1966, and that was the Orioles against the Dodgers. So that would have been my hometown, Los Angeles. And I'm a contrarian by nature.
Yes, I am married to one of those. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so if everybody is an LA Dodgers fan in Los Angeles, I have to not be.
So you gave them the bird.
Apparently, I gave them the bird at 11 months old. I was already ready. I was ready. Yes, and so I was going to embrace the other team, and somehow, and you know, the Orioles in the 60s, and I was too young to know in the 60s, but in the 70s, when I was a kid growing up, and baseball was really it. And there's no way to explain what baseball was like to people now. Then the 70s, the Orioles were great. They may have been the most successful franchise in the 70s. So it was a good time to be an Orioles fan.
Yeah.
And then the 80s were tough, and then the 90s were, and then I lost baseball. Sometime, you know what I always tell people is that free agency is much better for the players.
It's terrible for the heartache of loyalty.
But it's let's be honest, it's the fairer thing and all that. I get that. But when I was a kid in the 70s, before free agency really took off in baseball, I used to be able to name the starting lineups of every team in the major leagues because they didn't change that much.
Yeah, they didn't change.
And that's what's so crazy. Even now with CU and college football, I used to make sure I knew the lineup and the whole roster before the season.
So you're not a CSU fan. You're not that big of a contrarian. Like you actually like the Buffs.
No. Yeah, no, not like the Buffs. CU. I try to explain to my kids. My oldest was born in 2002. The year before she was born was the famous Vic over Nebraska in 2001 that was so big. And the whole time my daughter's been alive, CU's been pretty bad in football. And so she acts like they've always been bad. I said, honey, before you were born, we were a good team. And she goes, before I was born. And I think, you were born yesterday. What are you talking about?
But also, hasn't she met you? Like, you are always looking at the time before anyone was born and making it relevant.
She knows that.
She knows that. Do your kids listen to the 5?
No, my wife doesn't listen.
Your wife doesn't listen?
No.
Do they have to listen to you at the table? Who mostly talks at your table? That is a question that I've been dying to ask you, because I heard a story where you said it was your mother-in-law who said, do the podcast to shut you up at the table about all the things you cared about historically. Is that a true story?
Yeah, it's a true story. And I was already doing the Common Sense podcast, because that was what we did on radio, and that was just an extension of what I'd been doing for years. Yeah, she said, I think my own theory is that it was to shut me up because my dinner conversation was becoming a little too gory and grisly.
Yes.
And it was a good way to change the subject from the gore and grisly to just, oh, well, why aren't you? But yeah, those are one of those, I'm fascinated with those little turning point moments in one's life where you turn around and you look back and you go, if she hadn't said that at that dinner table, and if I hadn't acted upon it, well, you and I aren't having this conversation today. So it's weird and almost a little bit scary how your entire life can turn on tiny little things that almost didn't happen.
Well, and that, one of the questions that I sent you, I was thinking about, like, the tiny little turns in Dan's life that maybe aren't out there for folks to know if they were going to create a history of you. But where do those turns live? Where have you chronicled them? Do you have a best friend that you're writing to? Do you have journals? Do you have ways that you're kind of charting your own life story that until now are kind of hidden, but if someone came upon them, they'd be like, the secret papyrus of Dan Carlin?
Right. No, because I used to keep a journal for a very short period of time. Because, anybody who is a history major understands the importance, theoretically, of something like that. But when you go back and read them, and maybe it's not the same for everyone, I can only speak for myself, but I feel like hopefully we're always growing. And so when you go back and you read something like that, it seems horribly... it seems like an earlier version of you, and you're not necessarily happy with it anymore. Right. You know what I'm saying? So,
I do. I have boxes of journals I want to burn.
Yeah, you go, I'm so young then, or this worked out so much, or I wasn't thinking, or I know better now. And so you're kind of going, I don't want to read it, and I'm not sure I want anyone else to read it. And so I stopped trying after about a year, but sometimes I'll go back and read them to remind myself about why I don't do it.
When you listen to the podcast, or do you listen to your podcasts?
I have to listen to do them, but I almost never listen to them after.
You don't? Okay, so you don't listen, even the ones lately, I would say, do you think even those you want to redo? Because that's just like endless lifetimes of work. If you are never satisfied, is that part of your nature to always want to do more, to dig in?
I don't think that I'm the only one like that. I'll tell you what happens, and I know you probably know this yourself, because I find anyone who does creative work at a certain point in their life starts doing research on creative work.
Yes.
Especially if you make a living doing this. I remember reading about a comedian who said this, that there's a moment in a professional comedian's life, she said, where you go from, this is fun, it's an adventure, I'm just doing this for fun, to, oh my goodness, this is how I put food on the table. Yeah. And there's a different level of stress, and there's also a different level of concern as to where all the inspiration comes from, right? So like the podcast is predicated on a whole bunch of ideas that come up during the production of the work. Well, where do those ideas come from, right? It's the old idea of the muse, or someone speaking from the other side into your ear, yes, and giving. But the comedian I was listening to said the big fear that they always have is that that's going to go away.
They'll run out of material.
Well, you don't know where it comes from, so you don't know where it might go away, and if it goes away one day, where are you, right? And so I find that I did, and I think a lot of other people do, you start buying books on creativity because you start trying to figure out if there's a way to maximize this, right?
Yeah.
If you're stuck, or if you, sometimes you wake up and you're not feeling particularly creative. What do other creative people who have to make a living? We're all creative. But I mean,
did you do The Artist Way in the 90s? You know that book that had like kind of Japanese caricatures and Mount Fuji on the front, and it's in charcoal?
Oh, no.
Everyone was doing The Artist Way in the 90s.
Oh, no, I didn't read that. But that would have been a little early for me anyway.
Okay.
But I was doing, what did they say on MASH? Meatball surgery. I was doing meatball radio back then. So that would have been a little more creative than I was probably working on. But I buy books, like I have one called Daily Habits, and it's a book that chronicles sort of how a lot of famous creative people got in the mood, for lack of a better, or what their ritual was.
Yes.
And all those kind of things. And so I feel like to try to get back to the question, secret papyrus or where you get your idea, I find that going back and trying to figure out how to maximize the creativity is something that I'm interested in. And I find that as I do that, I always look back at the earlier work and think, I'd like to redo this.
And that space of imagination, you talk about that a lot in the intros of different episodes that I've listened to. We talk about imagination on this show as well, thinking about how do you kind of imagine as a way in, as you're saying with empathy, how do you imagine as a way in to get kind of more into the detail and the visceral storytelling? What fed your imagination as a child? Has this always been a ripe space for you, imagination and putting yourself into places?
Well, I think, listen, this makes it sound like it's something special to me or a very tiny group of people, but I think we're all like that. I mean, I grew up, as many people did, watching The Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone is one of those wonderful shows where every single show is different, but they're all Twilight Zones, right? I mean, there's a vibe or a feel. It can be a funny one. It can be a scary one. But they all fit under this umbrella where you go, this fits into sort of their brand. And I think that's the kind of thing where you're looking at how do you tell, Rod Serling was great at this, how do you tell a story that has contemporary value for your life now?
Yes. Lessons
or insights or stuff, but that's rooted in another time. So what makes the past interesting is not so much that it's just, oh, here's a wild story from the past. It's that even though, what did Shakespeare say, right? All the world's a stage and all the people merely players. The people in the story are people just like we are.
Yeah.
And so the ability to touch base with something that is otherwise impossible for us to relate to, right? The past is a foreign country. As the saying goes, they do things differently there. Trying to imagine living in a society where they perform human sacrifice, for example, is not possible for us. But you can start to realize that the people in the story are the same as we were. And if you took a human infant out of the incubator at your local hospital, put them in a time machine, sent them back in the past to a time where people enjoyed visiting public executions,
right,
and that child were raised in that culture, they too would enjoy going to public executions. So genetically speaking, we're the same people, and I think that's the in toward understanding the past, not the, I mean, if people ever end up on Mars someday, we might not be able to imagine what it's like to be on Mars, but we can imagine what it's like to be people,
yes,
even on Mars.
Yeah, as a person who I teach dance history, it really, to me, is about the people and then the context, right? And the people who are next to the people, and how, going to see a World's Fair was akin to having access to the World Wide Web, because you suddenly got to be in a moment in time in the 1900s. All these people came together, and then the form changed. So to say that with just dates and facts, but not to go, imagine that in this moment, Loie Fuller is there with Marie Curie at the same event, running into each other. And look what that did to dance. Look how technology and art, creativity and science came together because of that confluence of human people at an event. And that helps to get students excited versus this is the kind of piece that was made at this time on this date, but to really get into the storytelling. And then the letters, the archival material that actually brings those humans to life. I find I want students to get as excited about that as I do. What do you think we do in this generation of people who are learning with so much information that they maybe don't read the bylines perhaps the way you and I did, or dive into the works cited to get into the detail of like, what can make me feel here?
There's a lot to unpack in that question, because I think it touches upon a lot of things that I think about but don't have any answers for.
Okay.
I think we're, and look, I think this is self-evident and obvious, but we're involved in a mass giant human experiment right now. And anybody who's raising kids, even, my kids are late teens, early 20s, so but they're not really kids anymore. But this is all part of this generation, as I tell my oldest, that cropped up literally right after she was born. I mean, once the iPhone comes around and we're walking around with, what did Elon Musk say? We're all cyborgs now, right? Once we enter that world, we firmly leave the analog world behind. And what I mean by that is I try to explain to people that the entire history of humanity up until about the 21st century, maybe the very, very end of the 20th. That's an analog world, right? So if you grew up as I did in a pre-computer world, you lived in the same world that the people in ancient Assyria lived in, right? I mean, they came home when the metaphorical street lights went on, just like we did, right? No way to call mom, no tracking. All of that was a world that was human.
They didn't have Twilight Zone, though.
No, yeah, well, they had Twilight Zone in the 60s, though, and that was the
True.
But the point is so all of a sudden now we enter into a world where we don't know how this plays out because there hasn't been enough time. What's more, unlike ancient times where the pace of change was slow, so that even if there was some revolutionary new discovery, right, a brand new plow is invented that's going to change the entire world, you would probably have several hundred years to incorporate that new technology and see what that was going to do to even movable print, which shook up the whole world, is nothing compared to what we have now. Because what we have now, if you said nothing's really going to change for another 50 years, then we could sit there and try to incorporate what's happened, right? So there's the ability to absorb and sort of make it a part of, in other words, society sort of redirects around the inventions so that it then becomes the society plus those inventions. But what I think we're all aware of now is that the pace of change is so quick that by the time we would incorporate, oh my gosh, what is the world plus Facebook like?
It's already moved on.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the ability to ever get to the absorption phase is gone. And so what that does for society is a big unknown. And I'm going to actually route this to what you asked, I promise. Sometimes I forget, but I remember what you asked. So the question is often brought up about things like the ability to think deeply,
yes,
or to contemplate, or, can people get bored without their cell phone for 2 minutes? Does that rob us of the ability that ancient thinkers used to have to just sit out in the open air amongst the trees and think? Or, as one person pointed out, and I think there's real benefit to this too, the counter reaction to boredom. Right? What boredom makes us do to not be bored ends up being a lot. It sparks
creativity. It actually lights us up.
Yes. Games you have to invent as a kid because there are no easy access to something else, right? Yeah. I don't know what that means for society. I tell my kids all the time that if you happen to be somebody who bucks that trend, it reminds you of the line in the world of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, right? So, if you can do math and nobody can do math anymore, that's an advantage, right? So I always try to turn it into, well, if you're one of the few who reads, that's going to help you. I think doing the show when you're doing 5 hours of history podcasting sometimes, and that there's an audience for that, helps you go, oh, well, good. There's still that out there. But when you have more than 1 billion people as your potential audience, getting a few million here or there that are interested in your little niche thing is not necessarily reflective of broad societal trends.
Yes.
So I don't know that our audience is representative, and I'm not sure I can draw many conclusions from that.
So, but it doesn't make you want to go get those other billion. It makes you you don't want to have to necessarily adapt your path towards those folks who want the quick flip and quick hit. Does that?
I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that for several reasons. One, there's people who have that lane.
Yeah,
right? Lots of people who have that. It's an easier lane, to be honest. But also because it's the same thing with why I'm following the Baltimore Orioles when I live in Los Angeles and never been to Baltimore. I was a punk rock person. There's just a Generation X person. There's a whole bunch of things in my biography where you just kind of go, oh, this guy's going to do it differently. My wife would say, you just have to be different, don't you? And yeah, I think that's what it is. And so I don't want those other people. I kind of take pride. The audience invented a name for themselves. They call themselves the hardcore, CORPS.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, and so, but they take, and this is how I always was as a kid too. It's not that I'm different and bad. I'm different, and I'm going to take pride in that. And I want my several million instead of the billions because it's us.
Yes.
Right? It's our own private hardcore club.
In the basement.
And I don't want the other people. Yeah, and I don't, we're doing our own thing. You can go enjoy your 30-second TikTok pieces of entertainment.
I can't imagine you in that ball cap and black t-shirt as a punk rock guy? Like, who were you listening to? Were you pierced? What are we talking about? Did the visual change, or were you a contrarian there too, and you rolled up with your Orioles cap into the basement with people with mohawks?
Well, and I'm speaking to the people who were there now in your audience who remember. Punk is a caricature of what it was then, and so it's hard to describe like what it was like in 79 or 80 or 81
in LA, right?
Yeah, and I mean, listen, I remember John Doe, who was the lead singer of X. He had a great line. He said, "Punk was wearing black jeans and having a normal haircut, what we would call a normal haircut today." If you had short hair in 1978, people would yell out the car. He said people would yell out the car and yell Devo at you because that was he said all I had was a normal American haircut, but that was a statement in 1978.
Yeah.
So we looked more normal a lot of times. We had a lot of hair colors, but with me, like if you saw me at CU, I didn't look. I had long hair at CU.
Were you punk? Were you punk at CU?
I was always punk.
You were always punk.
But I mean, I think that's a personality trait. I think, you're punk in the 60s. But at CU, by that time, we were all growing our hair back out again because everybody had short hair by then. So if you look at pictures of me at CU, I had fantastically long hair sometimes when I look back on it now. I have this one shot of me outside, I think it's the Crossroads apartment, and the wind was blowing, and I'm wearing a leather jacket, I'm wearing high top sneakers, and the hair is blowing sideways in the wind. It's never been that good again, by the way.
But it came out in that Boulder mountain air.
Yeah, but punk is a mentality. It's not a look. And so, yes, I've always been that way before I knew what it was.
Yeah, well, when you were 11 months old in the crib giving a finger to the Dodgers.
Maybe. That's when it started.
I love that. You did mention a time machine about a minute ago, or 7, and do you believe in time machines? Do you want them to exist? Would you use one? What would you do with it? Like, what's the time machine ethos? Or would you be the contrarian that said, time machine, nope, not doing it. Don't sign me up for that ride.
I'm a person who loves the things that physics explores without any of the intelligence to understand any of it. but I read it anyway because it explains it. A lot of things like time, for example, are fascinating to me, and trying to figure out, the idea of time being a human construct is both impossible to imagine and fascinating to contemplate at the same time.
Absolutely.
And so trying to figure out, for example, reading theories about how perhaps, to just throw one of them out at you, how all time could be happening simultaneously. But when one is fascinated with the past and things like time machines and whatnot, one can't help but think about things, or the ideas of parallel universes, multiple realities, all these things. And again, this is almost like, where history and the Twilight Zone meet. It's this wonderful little zone I love to explore. But for me, looking at things like physics and the concept of time make the time machine question fascinating to me. And there's a whole bunch. For me, I just have questions, and the only way to answer them would be to go back in time and visually see them, because even if you explain them to me, maybe I'm too visual of a person, but I'm not sure I would understand them. And so I just want certain questions answered.
So
I don't
you
want to live
it.
in the past. I would, but I'm afraid of the dentistry. I don't want to get stuck back there, but I just want to see certain things and answer a few personal questions. That's all.
When you are diving into an idea and you're building your creativity, are you reading poetry from a time? Are you listening to the music of a time? Are you tracking the ways of knowing that come from different disciplines as a way into the history? Do you have certain places that you even like to go to that maybe are way outside your wheelhouse that actually help you get into a different body to understand a different episode? How do other disciplines, because I've heard you talk about Connie Chung when she gave a graduation speech said, oh, no, it wasn't my history classes. It was this class, this class, this class. For you, are there places that you go that you want to see the art of that time, or you want to experience how they would have thought of farming? Or is it all history to you? And so it's all inclusive and all part of your palette.
I think this goes back to the question where you and I were talking about reading about creatives. And I think what happens is and I think this is one of the wonderful things about what I do, is that every show presents a different dilemma, challenge, and opportunity. And some of the things you just mentioned are ways that I could if I've got a creative block on this, those are some of the things you might, maybe I could travel here, or maybe I could read something different. The one thing I want to avoid here, because the attraction of this podcasting was the creative white space, because in radio, you're so constrained in what you can do. And in this, it's a giant, the fact that you can do 5 hours with no breaks, that's a huge creative white space, right? So I don't want to do anything that messes with the creative white space. And one of the things that messes with that is formats or ruts or styles.
Yeah.
And so if we did something in the last show, I deliberately don't want to do that in the next one, because I don't want to get caught up. Like when I'll entertain offers to do things with outside companies, and everything they want to do is formatted, right? Because they have to sell it to somebody.
Yep.
So they have to have an elevator pitch, and it's got to be this. So right there, you're finding a little lane, and you're constructing.
And you're like, that's not
walls
punk. I'm not doing that.
No, well, and what it also is it's limiting your creative white space,
Yes.
right? And so by choosing to do things differently every time, we don't even know. Look, this is how you know what I do as an art project. If it was a business, I would know what the next 4 shows are going to be, right? You would have that planned out. It would all be on a whiteboard somewhere. I don't know what we're doing unless I'm in the middle of a series. I don't know what the next show is going to be till we're done with the last one. And part of what that allows us to do is to sit down and completely think about it differently. But what that means is I'm going to sit down at ground zero and go, what do I think about this? What are the weird aspects? And if you're not getting it, if it's not all flowing to you, then you've got to find some of those creative tricks, and some of the things you mentioned might be part of that repertoire, right? Traveling to a different location, checking out some of the other things in the time period. But there's no standard method, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, there's no formula to it. And you were a theater guy. Yeah, and that's true math from some bias?
True math, is it? I come from a family of artists. I do, and the next generation is unfortunately follow along in those footsteps too.
Don't say unfortunately. We're good people.
I think it's truthfully. I don't think we're constrained by our genes, but I think certain kinds of genes run in certain kinds of families. I think mathematics is one of those things. I think, and I think. So the answer to the question was yes. I was a theater major for the first 2 years when I was in college. I was in theater in high school, but I was always a history nerd.
But you were at CU a theater major.
No, I was at. I did my first 2 years in LA, and then you transferred over, and then transferred, and then became a history major. And when I transferred, and the funny thing is, and this is a lesson to all you kids out there, when I transferred to CU, they wouldn't accept any of the theater credits, which was a major, as anything other than
electives.
Electives, that's right. So I lost all my
chair of theater and dance, so I know how far we've come.
I lost all the electives, and I remember thinking to myself, I just blew 2 years of my life, is what I was thinking.
Heartbreaking.
And, but this is a good lesson, and it's partly why I'm such a big fan of things like higher education and not turning it into a trade school. So I do the history major, graduate with a history degree, and it turns out in a job that did not exist when I was in college,
yes,
I use both of those majors every day in my work.
Yes.
And that's why, I don't want people to turn college into a trade school, because you don't know what's coming. I have a cousin who always wanted to be a dentist their whole life. Went to college, became a dentist, was a year into dentistry before they decided they didn't like being a dentist but he was trained. Listen, good job. You have a career, a skill the rest of your life. But what if you don't want to do it?
That's right.
Right? The humanities doesn't give you that specific skill, but it gives you a broad foundational platform on which to pivot.
Yes.
And I think people forget that when they turn, it's the word that they would have used when I was a kid it was a bourgeois way to look at education, right? To look at it like a trade school, as opposed to creating what I always tell my daughter is a more formidable version of you. And that's what you're really after, because you do not know what's coming, but a more formidable version of you will be helpful.
Oh, I love that. And that, my friend, takes us into the segment of the podcast we call the quick and dirty, where I'm going to ask you questions and you got to answer them. And they're going to have an and in them, or they could be connecting two things, and it's got to be quick, which I know.
This is already too complicated for me.
You're going to do great. I
need the rules written down somewhere.
Okay. I will present you with a topic, and we want you to answer as fast as you can. And just be free associating, but it's going to have and in the word. Like if I said a place that you want to go visit, and you would say Andalusia.
Oh, okay. This is not going to work.
Everyone thinks this is going to be fun. They laugh a lot and they go really slow. So, okay.
All right.
All right. This is my first question. A historical landmark that you want to visit, or 2 historical landmarks you want to visit that you haven't been to yet.
Well, how about a couple of battlefields, Verdun and Ypres. Verdun is in France and Ypres is in Belgium.
I love it. And you haven't been to either?
No.
Okay.
Because I always travel with my family who don't want to go to battlefields.
They don't want to go to battlefields on their vacay?
No, they want to go shopping.
Yeah, no, we're not talking about shopping on this podcast.
All right.
Okay, your favorite combination of words you've ever put together for an episode title?
Oh, okay. The episode titles are fun, aren't they? They
They're
all sound
so
like
fun.
They all sound like heavy metal albums.
Now
don't
that
they?
I know that you're like a total punk guy, I'm like, oh, I get the hardcore and I get these titles.
Well, in this, I think it's always the same. Like the current show is Mania for Subjugation, so I'm into that. I like
They're all
Addicted.
band names. They all need
I
t-shirts.
like Addicted to Bondage is good.
Yes.
Addicted to Bondage on Slavery was a good one, and I liked Painfotainment. Nobody got it, but I guess it was supposed to be a play off infotainment, right? Yeah, I'm going to go with Addicted to Bondage. I like that one.
Okay, great. And we're going to have t-shirts made for our listeners. This is the dinner party question. You've probably been asked a million times, but I really want to know, who are the 4 historical figures you would bring together for a dinner party? And then I want to imagine how that's going to go. But who are the 4 folks you want to sit around a table with?
There's certain people I want to know, just because we're talking about Alexander the Great in the current show. He's always been somebody I've been fascinated with.
You dig Caesar a lot.
Caesar.
Yeah. Nailed it.
I think, to me, Caesar is a lot more approachable. Alexander is a lot harder to get your mind around who he really was. I had a professor at CU who taught me a great lesson when looking at archival film footage. He said, and photographs. He said, you need to look at all of the things in the photo that are there sort of by chance, right? The things that the photographer wasn't meant to get in, or the stuff behind the person. Or specifically with combat war footage, he wanted me to look in the eyes of the people and said, realize that this person is involved in the most intense day they're ever going to have. Look in their eyes. And so when I thought about Alexander the Great having a podcast, all the things I want to see are, what's the background look like? What's the chair he's sitting on look like? What's the clothing? All the little things that would tell you a ton about their time period without you ever having to be told specifically about their time period. So getting all these people together at a dinner party, for example, would be an attempt on my part to mix enough eras and people
that you could Zoom room them. Like right now, I see your books. I want to zoom in. I want to know what that photograph is. Yeah. I'm gonna say you got to that answer, even though I don't think you said 4 humans, but because it's the quick and dirty, I didn't
say and. Was and involved?
Well, it's implied. We're gonna let the ampersand be implied on that one.
All right.
I sometimes make people go back and redo it to get the and in there, so it would be like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great.
That's
and
right.
Genghis Khan and then okay, I'll let you float on the 4th one. Okay, a food and beverage combination that you have in your tiny room to help get you through the endurance work of a 5-hour podcast. What's your fuel?
Oh, well, there's no food. Food just slows you down. It's usually just lots of coffee.
And
then if we're recording after about 12 noon, we switch to high-powered tea. That's about it.
I love that. Okay, a Boulder locale from your university days that you're thinking of, and then a favorite place when you come back to Boulder now that you would hold. Kind of nostalgia question.
Favorite place from the university days? Goodness gracious. I used to go up to like Boulder Creek, and there was always weird stuff. And I was at CU in the 80s where there was still a lot of weirdness. I remember a girlfriend and I used to go up to Boulder Creek, and there was this one guy living up there, and he never looked like he was living outdoors. He had this big dog named Mrs. Brown.
I love that you remember the dog's name.
Yeah, I do. Well, because it was because Mrs. Brown provided everything he needed. She used to go get food for him and bring it back. And I didn't believe it. And he said, well, come back tomorrow and I'll show you. So we went up and you hang by the creek and he'd send the dog away and she'd come back like 20 minutes later. And
like with a steak dinner? Like what's she bringing back?
Well, here was my theory. Have you ever seen like there's videos on like YouTube and stuff where you can see dogs walk into convenience stores, grab something off the shelf and walk out? It was always my thought that either that dog did that or that dog had a friend at one of these stores that thought she was hungry, gave her stuff, and she just brought it back to the guy up at Boulder Creek. But those are the kind of things. We had weird stuff at CU.
Okay, I'm also going to let you slide on the end of that unless you want to say what your favorite Boulder spots are now if you want to and it.
Oh, well, now, listen, these days, just going to Folsom Field is fun, and I've gotten a chance now to go on the field and do a couple of things like that. So it just makes you feel even more connected to something where it's funny. I think this is what happens sort of when you leave the school and the sports team becomes a thread connecting you back to that.
Yes.
I think it's more important to me now than it was as a student.
Yes.
So I think Folsom Field's more important to me now than it was when I was a student there.
Yeah, I love that. This is a funny one. And then we have one more after this. So if you've got a voice that people know, people listen to, people who want to listen to. Let's say that, because there's also a billion people who don't listen to you.
That's right.
In the Dan Carlin voice, what do you think would be products that would be hilarious for you to sell in your voice?
Well, I don't have to think too hard because they actually ask me. Well, one of the things we don't do much on the show is advertisements.
Right.
We get asked by everybody, but I'm just, one of the real luxuries of not being on radio anymore is not having to do that if you don't want to.
Yeah.
I am a very uncomfortable pitch man. When I actually sell something on the radio, I really do use that because that's the only way I'm going to do it. But the things that come our way are really interesting. I mean, and it's funny because, you say, you laugh and you tell the guys, no, we're not doing that. And then you hear it on someone else's show.
Somebody said yes to it.
Yeah. The marital aids or all these. And it's just, you're sitting here going, not in a million years. Even things like alcohol and stuff, which, it doesn't seem like it should be a big deal, but I'm not going to do it. That's just not,
You're not the Dos Equis guy now?
No.
You passed on that? So that's how he got the gig. It could have been you.
It was totally going to be me. No, but I wouldn't mind pushing some of the bands we used to like back in the day,
okay,
right?
Line those up for me.
Well, there's first of all what they call, this is how you know you're old. You go to Amazon and the bands you listen to are now called proto-punk, which is an invention. The bands that came around in the 70s that we call punk now hated the name punk because they didn't consider themselves punk. Now to be called proto-punk,
it's so
they've
bad.
got to be spinning in their graves. But it's all the stuff from the 60s. So you think like the MC5 is a wonderful one. So we just lost Wayne Kramer and we lost their manager, John Sinclair, all this year. Mm-hmm. And I think Dennis Thompson died literally 3 weeks ago. So that's the end of them. So every member of the MC5 is dead now. So the MC5, the Stooges, both out of Michigan, those are so-called proto-punk bands, the New York Dolls.
Yeah.
And then you get to the 70s, and then you get real punk bands who didn't know they were punk. You get like the Dead Boys, you get the Ramones. I'm listening though still to a lot of that stuff because it's widely eclectic.
Yeah.
The stuff that you were listening to. I mean, things like, Roxy Music. Some of their stuff is so weird, and they would play off how weird it was on the song. They have a line in one of their songs, "This crazy music drives you insane." Well, that's an understanding of how weird this was hitting the listeners sometimes. And in my mind, we're doing the same thing that they were doing in the sense that they weren't trying to play to the broader audience.
That's right.
They wanted the money, they wanted the success, but they could have gone that route if they'd wanted to. They didn't want to.
Yeah, I was in Seattle in '93. I left school in New York, and it was that world. And I've heard you talk about being on the ground of a historical moment. That felt like the ground of a historical moment.
You were in the scene as you get to be cool, as Neil Young once said.
And we didn't know we were grunge. We were just wet wearing flannel. Like it was just the way it was.
They tell you later what it was, and that's part of the segmentizing your life, right?
Yeah, but we were just in a moment. Okay,
that was just your scene.
Yeah, it was our scene. Okay, this is the last thing we do on the show, and you might hate it except for the fact that you actually are probably gonna, I saw you speak on the big screen at a graduation, but if you were given the speech, you're given the commencement address, you're just gonna give us a line. You've already given us some advice on the show today, but if you were to say, and may your knives be sharpened when you leave for battle, whatever is and may the road rise to me. That was, that I was taking it as a throwback all the way to.
That's a good Irish saying right there.
Well,
yes.
That's what my Nana said.
Yes.
No,
my mom too.
But could you throw one of those at us that starts with and I'm going to make you start with and, so it's like you've gotten to the end, and then send us out, Dan. Send us off into the future.
And you're going to be surprised. I mean, that's maybe the. I think people are thrown for a curve nowadays, especially young people are thrown for a curve when things don't turn out the way that they planned. And I'm reminded of the John Lennon line where he said, "Life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans." And I think in the commencement speech we quoted Mike Tyson, where he talked about everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's what life is like. And I think telling people, I always say if you tell people everything is going to be great and then it's not, you're setting them up for disappointment. If you let people understand that life is a struggle, that it's always been a struggle, and that you take your victories and your enjoyment when you can, and you realize that the enjoyment of those times is set up by the times that are not good. I mean, in other words, anybody who has ever succeeded has had to push through those moments. So it's not a guarantee you will succeed, but you're going to probably need to be able to push through those moments to succeed.
That was Dan Carlin on the Ampersand. For more about Dan, see our show notes. The Ampersand is a production of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. It is written and produced by me, Erika Randall, and Tim Grassley. If there are people you'd like us to interview on the Ampersand, do please email us at asinfo@colorado.edu. Our theme music was composed and performed by Nelson Walker, and the episodes are recorded at Interplay Recording in Boulder, Colorado. I'm Erika Randall, and this is The Ampersand.